Tinder, Match.com, etc., etc. There is many ways to find love or a belonging these days. Just a swipe here and a swipe there and whoops, an opportunity has risen. But the seeking of companionship isn't at all new. People were hungry to find a mate then, just as they are now. I think you've heard the stories. It happens everywhere from time to time these days. Someone gets a match on Tinder, they meet up and end up a victim, dead, murdered. It wasn't as easy back then, but in the early 1930s they did have what was called matrimonial agencies. It was like a dating site before the internet. People would place their ads and wait for a response. And that's what Harry Powers did. Powers was a sick man, but he wasn't stupid. He would state in the papers that he was rich, that he would provide a life of luxury to his wife, and that they would be treated well. You see, back then it wasn't all about hooking up. It was kind of frowned upon, actually. It was almost like a marriage proposal thrown into the sea, and someone would pick it up and accept it. Detroit's American Friendship Society opened up in 1927. It was the Lonely Hearts Club, and lonely men and women from all over Detroit would place and answer ads posted. One of these ads read, "Wealthy widower, worth $150,000. Income is $400 to $2,500 per month. Profession is civil engineer. Own a beautiful 10-room brick home, completely furnished with everything that would make a good woman happy. My wife would have her own car and plenty of spending money. Would have nothing to do but enjoy herself." The man who had placed this ad was Harry Powers, and in 1931, Asta Eicher, a 50-year-old widow with 3 children, answered the ad. Her kids was Greta, 14 years old, Harry, 12, and Annabelle, 9 years old. Asta began corresponding with Harry and soon fell in love with him. She told a boarder living at the residence, a man named William O'Boyle, to move out because the man she knew as Pearson was moving in. Only a month had gone by, but William O'Boyle had forgotten some tools in his old residence. So in August of 1931, he went back to Asta's house, but neither she nor her kids were anywhere to be seen. But Harry Powers, aka Pearson, was there, emptying out the house. Suspicious, William O'Boyle contacted police, who came and questioned Harry Powers. Harry introduced himself as Cornelius Pearson and told the officers that Asta and her 3 children had gone to Colorado. But police kept prodding. Apparently no one had ever heard of Cornelius Pearson before, and the love letters he had sent to Asta had been sent from a farmhouse in West Virginia. They soon also found out that his real name was Harry Powers, and that he had been married for 4 years. What had been a creeping suspicion in the background was now hanging thick in the air. It was so thick they could almost feel it. Something was clearly going on. Harry Powers' facade began falling apart as he told police conflicting stories. Police would begin searching the farm and found a heap of clothes and jewelry. Then they found 4 corpses, put into burlap sacks, buried in a shallow mass grave. It was the corpses of the missing family. But police also found the body of a 50-year-old divorcee, Dorothy Lemke. She had disappeared some time before, and it seemed like they had found her. Harry Powers probably had more victims, but no one else was identified. However, 5 was enough for a death penalty. The murders in and of themselves is a tragedy, but when Harry Powers described how he had murdered the family, a disgust and hatred so fucking pure began taking shape. He had hung them, but not only that, He had taken the 12-year-old boy and forced him to watch as he hung the boy's mother, then his big sister, and then his little sister. When the kid began screaming, however, Harry, fearing the noise would alert the neighbors, grabbed a hammer and smashed it into 12-year-old Harry Iker's skull. Harry Powers loved the feeling of power. He enjoyed watching them choke on the rafters. He was a sadist. He had murdered his victims with a noose, and a noose would be his final destination. Harry Powers was hung by the neck until he died in Moundsville Prison, West Virginia on March 18, 1932. We don't know how many people he actually killed, but at least 5 victims died on the murder farm. Johnny Meadows stalked the women of Odessa, Texas for 4 years. He claimed 6 victims, all to quench his own dirty desires. He was a lust killer, driven by sexual fantasies, and it all began in a laundromat on October 19, 1968. Linda Cugat, a barmaid, had been missing for over 2 months. It was at the laundromat that she had last been seen, but not a trace of her had been found since then. Was she alive? Was she dead? People wondered what had happened to Linda Cugat, and in December of 1968, her badly decomposed corpse was found on the outskirts of town. She was nude, and her killer had taken one of her nylon stockings and tied her hands behind her back with them. He had then taken her other stocking, with which he had strangled Linda Cugat. Linda was raped and strangled to death in the fall of 1968. So many years ago. They were now looking for a killer, a lust killer as they were called back then. This was before the term serial killer had been coined. But there is no doubt that Johnny Meadows, the Odessa sex slayer, was a serial killer. A killer with deep, dark and sadistic sexual compulsions. But as the discovery of Linda's remains made detectives look deeper, they found a similar case. It was in the neighboring town of Monaghan, where a motel owner, Dorothy Smith, had been found nude, a television cable tied tightly around her wrists, and another television cable wrapped around her neck. Dorothy Smith had been found on November 5th, 1968. She was killed 2 weeks after Linda Cugat's disappearance, but now as Linda had been found dead, people began to wonder, who was this sex fiend stalking the women of Odessa, and who would be next? But as in so many other cases, just as the terror and panic sets in, the killer, in this case Johnny Meadows, went silent. 1969 passed without any incident. Maybe he had gone away. The 2 murders in 68 was still lurking somewhere in the back of people's minds as the 70s rolled in. And it was in the summer of 1970, July 16th to be exact, that the sex slayer struck again. Her name was Eula Miller, and this time Johnny Meadows had changed his ways a little bit. Maybe it was the darkness that had built up within him. Maybe the pressure and the urges made him go nuts on Eula. He had stabbed her multiple times. There was stab wounds all over her neck and all over her torso. He had gotten into her apartment somehow, and that is where they found her. It was a mess. But the sudden change of MO may not have thrown law enforcement off as much as it may have in the 80s. They didn't look at the psychology in the same way back then. Sure, they followed patterns and stuff, but to them this perpetrator was just a crazy and impulsive lust killer. And I'm sure you need a dash of crazy to do these things. Not traditionally crazy, but just abnormal. But we know this already, because we have hindsight. We can look back and study these killers and these cases. We know that some of them appear normal. Take BTK for example. And then we also know that some of them are just impulsive maniacs, like Mark Stroman, the 9/11 revenge killer. Anyone can be a serial killer, dumb or smart, male or female, driven by sex, compulsions, revenge, mercy, or madness. And the truth is, I don't know enough about Johnny Meadows to say which category he fits into, but I don't think he seemed too crazy for people looking in on the outside. He reminds me of the stocking strangler, Carlton Gary. Nancy Miller was sleeping in her bed on September 16, 1970. Her kids were sleeping in the next room. The house was quiet, but at some point during the night, the sex slayer entered Nancy Miller's bedroom and abducted her. Her kids woke up the next morning, but there was no mommy there. She was gone, and she wouldn't be found until a year later on an oil lease outside of town. By that point, all that remained of Nancy Miller was bones. Johnny appeared to have changed his MO by now, because instead of breaking into a home, killing his victim, leaving them there, he had begun abducting them, dumping them elsewhere. His next victim was Ruth Maynard. Ruth was the wife of a police officer, so murdering her would really catch attention. She disappeared from her home on January 17, 1971, and her nude, decomposing body was found a month later, just a couple of miles from where Linda Cugat had been found nude, decomposed and strangled just a couple of years earlier. In June of 1971, a sixth woman disappeared. She was a secretary in the neighboring town of Kermit. Her name was Gloria Green. In December of 71, Johnny Meadows had been arrested on an unrelated charge. But while incarcerated in New Mexico, he began yapping, talking about his murders, his conquests. This of course attracted law enforcement from Odessa to interview Johnny, and he began talking. He confessed to what he had done and agreed to tell them where Gloria Green's body was if they were willing to pay his wife $2,000. The local sheriff agreed, and Johnny Meadows gave them the directions. Police followed them to a vacant lot in Odessa, and there she was. Gloria Green's decomposed body had been stuffed beneath a rotting mattress. Johnny Meadows was given 99 years in prison. Double Feature is a home for obscure cases, and the other day I found something I have never seen before. I found Dorothy Williams, a female serial killer who murdered 3 elderly citizens in the late 80s. The thing about Dorothy is that she is the very first black female serial killer I have ever found, and she was a violent woman, bludgeoning, strangling, beating and stabbing old and vulnerable people to death. Now, this isn't triple feature, but rest assured that I will cover Dorothy Williams in my next double feature. With that said, I truly do hope that you have found it compelling to be a part of tonight's double feature.